Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. So today we are going to be reviewing or just kind of looking at the video that, let's see, just a moment. Yeah, we're going to be looking at a video that, or I'm just going to be giving commentary on the video that Stephen A. Smith did with Ben Shapiro. Just a moment, sorry. I Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry. Now I'm situated. I'm situated. I am ready to talk about this. So, Stephen A. Smith recently interviewed Ben Shapiro, and the interview was about the George Floyd incident where Derek Chauvin unalived George Floyd. And of course, we understand that he was found guilty at a trial and was sentenced. And so, if you have been following the headlines, you understand that Ben Shapiro is calling for Derek Chauvin's release. He's calling for Derek Chauvin to be pardoned. Stephen A. Smith disagrees, and so do I. I stand next to Stephen A. Smith and those who disagree with Ben Shapiro's position. Of course, there is, I believe, his reasoning is fallacious for a number of reasons. But even if, let's say, for example, even if there was a pardon at the federal level, many civil rights activists and lawyers and educators have stated that Chauvin would still have to contend with the sentence at the state level. And so President Donald Trump can't pardon Chauvin at the state level. This pardon can only come at the federal level. And so I disagree with the arguments that are being made by that are actually being made by Ben Shapiro on in his interview with Stephen A. Smith. But let's go ahead and get into that. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to share my screen. And so we're going to actually watch this together, and I'll kind of give commentary as we go. And we're not going to watch the entire thing. It's a very long video, so I'm just going to watch bits and pieces of it.
Thank God, doing well, Stephen. How are you doing?
Okay, I want to ask, and I asked this affectionately. I'm not trying to be insinuating. You called me a jackass. How many dudes did you call a jackass and then you go on this show? Could you tell me that? Could you answer that one first?
Hey, I appreciate you having me on. And an invitation, is open the other way around. It's shocking. Derek, the person who died, as opposed to the racial or religious identity of the person who was the police officer. I just don't think that that's how we ought to decide criminal justice cases in general.
In fairness to you, I can understand that in general. Damn it, in most instances, I can agree with that. But those are cases that we hear about. I'm talking about the visual impact. So let's stay right there, Ben. I am a black man, and I see this black man on the ground, face down, handcuffs behind him. Face is imprinted into the pavement.
Really happened. I mean, there's a full trial. There were autopsy reports. May 30th and June 1st. If you look at my tweets, I'm saying the same kind of things you're saying right now. I'm saying the same kind of things at that time that everybody else is saying, seeing the tape, because there's no way to look at the tape and not be sort of shocked by what you're seeing on the tape, obviously. And then I think that the mark of a reasonable person is to change your opinion as the evidence changes. A lot of evidence emerged between the time that the tape was released, that horrible 9-minute tape, and the time the conviction actually happened. And there's a full trial. There were autopsy reports. There's witness evidence. There were other people whose testimony was taken. There were multiple medical specialists who were called. And so in looking at all of that, that's the way we're supposed to adjudicate whether or not a person deserves to spend 22 years in prison, not based simply on our immediate gut response to the tape. And again, I had the same gut response to the tape that you did, and I think that everybody did. I think actually that tends to be the gut response of people when we see a lot of police activity. Actually, it turns out that police do a lot of things that look really rough on tape and really difficult on tape, and this was one of those things. And then as we later learned that, for example, the sort of tactic that Chauvin is using there was actually trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, right? Putting the submission technique that's used if you have a person who's resisting arrest, or if you learn during the course of the investigation that George Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," before he's even taken out of the car. He says, "I can't breathe" on the longer tape 6 times before he's even taken out of the car. I mean, it's a very long interaction with the police officers before you get to that.
Based on the preponderance of evidence that you threw into the fray in order to ask for this man to be pardoned. I'm just going by, there are certain things that you just see, and 1 + 1 = 2.
So, I mean, Stephen, actually, if you go back to my tweets at the time, May 30th and June 1st, if you look at my tweets, I'm saying the same kind of things you're saying right now. I'm saying the same kind of things at that time that everybody else is saying, seeing the tape, because there's no way to look at the tape and not be sort of shocked by what you're seeing on the tape, obviously. And then I think that the mark of a reasonable person is to change your opinion as the other.
Various others, obviously with a lot of people on the left as well, before the preponderance of evidence that you're alluding to came into play. I get that. So in fairness to you, I have to say that. But sometimes I'm going to say this to you because you're a pretty brilliant dude. Nobody issue. And what I would say to you as a black man in America, that there are times, and there's a preponderance of evidence throughout the years that shows that police.
Now, I want to go into, where did he say? Let's see. I think it's at 13. I think we're here, ladies and gentlemen.
Originally thought it was, then you're not doing your job as a commentator. So I can have the same gut response that you have when I first see that tape. The question is what you do when more of those facts emerge, when you do see more of that evidence emerge, when you do read the testimony and see the autopsies.
See, but I believe, and this is just my belief, because in fairness to you, you're absolutely right. You did put out that tweet initially, and your position was it was shared by the Hannitys of the world, the Mark Levins of the world, and various others, obviously with a lot of people on the left as well,
It's
before
here.
the preponderance of evidence
Oh
that
my
you're alluding
God,
to came
where-
into play. I get that. So in fairness to you, I have to say that. But sometimes I'm going to say this to you because you're a pretty brilliant dude. Nobody can deny it. With what you've accomplished with the Daily Wire, what you've been able to do in your career. I'm just reading something. You were a syndicated columnist at the age of 17 for crying out loud. This is who you are. This is who I'm talking to here.
Okay,
The autopsy showed that Floyd, unfortunately, had incredibly enlarged, much heavier than normal. His lungs were much larger than normal person's lungs because of heavy and overtime drug use. He had 11 nanograms of fentanyl in his system at the time per milliliter.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, Shapiro argues that because Floyd had enlarged lungs, that contributed to his untimely death, right? So I disagree with the position that Ben Shapiro, the argument that Ben Shapiro is making. Like, I just did a lot of research before uploading this video or coming onto this stream, and there's not a lot of evidence that shows that persons with enlarged lungs that this is a fatal situation. Yes, I mean, if there are other factors at play, then it can be fatal, but the treatment is really outpatient. It's not inpatient treatment, and it's not surgical. And so I think that is a flawed argument. And plus, the legal expert has testified that Floyd died because his breathing was restricted. So they didn't testify that Floyd died because he had narcotics in his system, right? And I'm not arguing that a person who has narcotics in their system that wouldn't lead to that person being unalived, untimely, right? Because we see this all the time. People go out and they drink, and then sometimes they get alcohol poisoning, etc. But ladies and gentlemen, in this specific case, there is not enough evidence to support Shapiro's position that the drugs that he had in his system, along with having large lungs, that contributed. This was the proximate cause, right, of his unalivement, as Ben Shapiro would like for us to believe. Now, the Stephen A. Smith I think he's using the wrong. He's saying preponderance of the evidence, so he's using like the wrong standard, or the incorrect burden of proof. In criminal cases, it is beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil cases, it's by the preponderance of the evidence. So I think like he's getting the burden of proof and the standard of proof mixed up with civil cases. But at any rate, let's continue.
Blood, which is over 3 times what it would cause normally to kill somebody. The original autopsy report openly said that if George Floyd had been found in his house in the same exact physical condition, they would have called it death by overdose. So all of these things taken into account raises the question of reasonable doubt, right? The standard in our criminal justice system is in fact a reasonable doubt standard. And that raises the question as to why there's not at the very least reasonable doubt. So you can say that your sort of first jump at this is he's guilty, look at the knee on his neck. There's no damage to his neck tissue, by the way, in the autopsy report. You can say all of that, and you can say that that's a plausible explanation. I won't even make a case that that's not a plausible explanation. I'll make a case that a plausible explanation is not enough to convict a man in court, especially based on the surrounding circumstances, the amount of pressure that was brought. This was not a fair trial, was one of the points that I'm making. So when it comes to the actual trial itself, there are members of the jury who are at actual rallies wearing shirts that said "I can't breathe" before they were.
Ben Shapiro, that is, there is no way that we can agree with that argument that you just made, it's highly improbable, if not impossible, for a police officer to have his knee on a person's neck for 9 minutes, pressing down on it vigorously, and there not be any damaged tissue. But let's take your reasoning. Let's say that there wasn't any damaged tissue. That still does not mean that the knee didn't cause the unalivement. I mean, does it? I mean, when we think about it, let's say, for instance, if I am on the ground and a police officer has their knee on my neck and has it on my neck for 9 minutes, it, and that is suffocating me, do you think that the autopsy report would not show that there is damage? Now, I think that Ben Shapiro is speaking very quickly and he is just trying to get facts, or not necessarily facts, but disinformation over on Stephen A. Smith here, because again, we seen the video. The video was right before our eyes, and what we seen in the video was that Derek Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck for approximately 9 minutes, and that did contribute to his unalivement. And I'm pretty sure the autopsy report shows that as well. Indeed, in this video, Stephen A. Smith, he admits that the legal experts testify that Floyd, eh, he was unalived. He lost his life in this particular situation because his breathing was restricted. So if his breathing was restricted, then what did that, right? And essentially what the reasonable conclusion that one could draw from the facts that are before us is that the knee that belonged to Derek Chauvin restricted that breathing, and that caused his unalivement. Let's continue.
Actually on the jury. There were members of the jury who have openly said that they felt public pressure to convict in a particular way. The president of the United States, or one of the people who was running for president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, was openly calling for his conviction. Minneapolis City paid the family of George Floyd.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't buy this argument that Ben Shapiro is putting before us, that the jury felt pressured to convict. Ladies and gentlemen, if you know anything about jury trials, they are independent in many ways, and there are rules in place against jury tampering. And so these jury bodies come together, they convene, they have discussions about the evidence, and sometimes they are isolated for several hours. They're isolated for several hours having these discussions about the evidence. And the only persons that could persuade the jurors are those persons within the room. Now, that does not mean that jury tampering does not happen, or that people aren't persuaded, or uh, I guess moved by evidence outside of the courtroom. But I don't think that that happened in this particular case. Like, there was evidence before them that they had to consider, and they considered the evidence, and that evidence was that the police officer was guilty of this crime. Now, is it within the realm of possibility that when they walked through the ended their day, or possibly started their day, that the protesters were out uh, and saying convict Chauvin? Well, yeah, that's a possibility, and that probably did happen. But remember that the power remains within the hands of the jury and within the fingertips of the jury. And it's the jury who actually decides whether or not that person is guilty or innocent. And so essentially, I seriously doubt that protesters pulled any of those jurors to the side and said, you should vote this way or you should vote that way. No, because that would be called or that would be considered jury tampering. And we know that that did not happen. So Ben Shapiro's argument there is, a bit irrational.
Floyd, I believe, it's a $27 million payout in the middle of the trial. So all of this tends to go to, is that an impartial jury, right? These all have serious consequences for the jury system. And so there's really a few separate questions. One is, was Chauvin responsible for Floyd's death? I think on that question, I would say no. You can say yes. I would say at the very least there's reasonable doubt. And then there's the question of the amount of pressure that was brought on the jury in this particular case to bring a verdict. This was the most highly publicized trial of the modern era by a long shot, because the incident itself had spurred so much public angst and outrage and massive protests involving 20 million people and riots that cost the taxpayers some $2 billion or insurance companies some $2 billion. It was the most highly publicized trial probably since the OJ trial. And because of that amount of public pressure, did Chauvin receive a fair trial is obviously a very crucial question here.
New military-grade technology increases water pressure by 15 times without using any energy.
But it sounds like your position is that this...
Ladies and gentlemen, the people in the United States that often get... when you are part of the dominant society, you often get a fair trial over, the Black Americans. And so you get, his trial was fair because he had legal funding. So he had access to representation. He had the police union backing him. The trial was public. And he had expensive lawyers that were able to choose who expensive lawyers that essentially chose the jury pool, right? Chose the people that were there and made that decision. Chauvin unalived a man who didn't deserve to die that day. That's just the truth. Now, we can go back to the argument about George Floyd allegedly having a counterfeit bill in his hand and maybe trying to purchase, I don't know, was it stuff from a convenience store with that, or he was trying to purchase something in a convenience store? But that's separate, right? That's a misdemeanor at best. And it's a misdemeanor if he was trying to take something out of the store, right? And perhaps that's a felony because he has a counterfeit bill. But that does not mean that the person's life should be ended. That doesn't mean that because a person is using a counterfeit bill, and again, I don't condone the use of that, but that doesn't mean that, okay, because Floyd was using a counterfeit bill, that is a justification for Chauvin to end his life. No, it's not. Let's continue.
This is more of a political issue as opposed to a policing issue. And what I would say to you as a Black man in America, that there are times, and there's a preponderance of evidence throughout the years that shows that policing has been an issue as it pertains to Black men, which is one of the things that we constantly bring up. So when that incident happened, I'm thinking about...
Now, Stephen A. Smith is right here. Policing has been an issue as it relates to Black men in the United States of America. He's not wrong about that.
The officer himself, Ben Shapiro, and his intent from the standpoint, you're having your knee on the back of his neck, no matter what, from a medical perspective, we can deduce may have transpired in the end if you didn't...
If you want to make a full-time income from home working part-time, you need to know this one concept because there...
Well, would that have mattered?
The testimony in CBI.
Clamoring for you to get off the back of his neck while you got him handcuffed into the ground. Okay, why is it wrong for us to stop there and say that was excessive on the part of the police officer because you had him contained? He wasn't a threat to you. What's wrong with that thinking?
Okay, so there are a couple of things that could be argued by the defense, and in fact, were argued by the defense in this case. One of them, again.
Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen, what Stephen A. Smith said? Like, okay, Chauvin already had Floyd on the ground with his hands behind his back. He wasn't a threat to the police officers. So there wasn't any need for more force that was put on Floyd. Let's continue.
again, was this was a trained technique by the Minneapolis Police Department to keep somebody in this position so long as you have not called a code 4, which is where you say there's an all clear. Now you can move the person who's on the ground into the ambulance, for example, if you've already called the ambulance, or back into the police vehicle. When it comes to the actual question as to causation of death, or you have to be the proximate cause of the death, it's not just enough for it to be a contributing factor, because it turns out that increased stress can cause death in a person who has a human heart that is significantly larger than normal. The autopsy showed that Floyd, unfortunately, had an incredibly enlarged heart, much heavier than normal. His lungs were much larger than normal person's lungs because of heavy and overtime drug use. He had 11 nanograms of fentanyl in his system at the time per milliliter of blood, which is over 3 times what it would cause normally to kill somebody. The original autopsy report openly said that if George Floyd had been found in his house in the same exact physical condition, they would have called it death by overdose. So all of these things taken into account raises the question of reasonable doubt. Right? The standard in our criminal justice system is in fact a reasonable doubt standard, and that raises the question.
Ben Shapiro's wrong here again, ladies and gentlemen. In order for there to be death by an overdose, that means that the person needs to be dead, right? I mean, that's common sense. And in order for a person to overdose and suffer some, serious incident, some medical incident, we need to see that, right? And that didn't happen on the day in question. So let's entertain that thought for a moment. Let's say that George Floyd had an overdose of this narcotic in his system. Yeah, but he could go to the emergency room and they could get that out of his system. If he was overdosed, Chauvin could have called the ambulance, or they could have the paramedics could have got that out of his system, right? But what happened on the day in question was not the incident. Even if he did have this narcotic in his system, even if that were the case, it still does not take away what the facts are. And the facts is that Floyd was on the ground and Chauvin had his knee on his neck for 9 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, what person would survive that? What person would survive having what person would survive being on the ground and having someone's knee on their neck for 9 minutes? What person would survive that? I don't know what person would. Narcotic in their system or not?
Question as to why there's not, at the very least, reasonable doubt. So you can say that your sort of first jump at this is he's guilty. Look at the knee on his neck. There's no damage to his neck tissue, by the way, in the autopsy report. You can say all of that, and you can say that that's a plausible explanation. I wouldn't even make the case that that's not a plausible explanation. I'll make the case that a plausible explanation is not enough to convict a man in court, especially based on the surrounding circumstances, the amount of pressure that was brought. This was not a fair trial. Is one of the points that I'm making. So when it comes to the actual trial itself, there were members of the jury who were at actual rallies wearing shirts that said "I can't breathe" before they were actually on the jury. There were members of the jury who have openly
patient enough to draw that conclusion. Looked at the experts who were saying with the trade, there was no reason, and you saw it. I'm sure you saw this, and not to say that you would embrace it with the level of sincerity that others may, because I know the level of skepticism that you look at when you see the news outlets. And by the way, I don't blame you. I'm with you on that, okay? But I would say to you, listening to experts talk about how police officers are trained and pointing to the fact that Derek Chauvin had no business being in that position and putting George Floyd in that position.
Okay, did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? All the training that America allocates to police officers, to police departments, all the training that is allocated to these police departments, and for some reason Chauvin didn't implement or exercise that training in this particular situation. Now, let's keep in mind this was a very low stakes situation. Floyd wasn't being combative or abusive. He didn't have a weapon on him. He wasn't fighting Chauvin. So there's not an argument there that, okay, well, this was a split-second decision that was made, right? No, this wasn't a split-second decision that Chauvin made. This was a calculated decision that he made. Indeed, he was in that position for 9 minutes. And if you watch that video, he looked as if he was very relaxed in that position. It wasn't like he was struggling to hold Floyd down in that position. And he wasn't calling for everybody, hey, come help me, come help me. So why didn't he implement the training is the question.
and particularly once he was handcuffed and contained. To me, that, along with the ultimate outcome, is all the evidence I need. And that's where we might differ.
I mean, that's totally fair if we differ on that. I guess the question I would ask you is,
It's all the evidence I need to, Stephen A. Smith. I agree with you.
given the fact that that was a Minneapolis Police Department trained protocol, given the fact that Floyd did ask to be removed from the car. I mean, in the lead up to the situation, the part of the tape that nobody watches, he was actually outside the car. The police officers moved him inside the car. He says he's claustrophobic, and then he claims 6 consecutive times that he cannot breathe while he's in the car. So if the idea is that it was the police officer's knee that deprives him of breath, he was already claiming that he couldn't breathe inside the car, suggesting he was already in the middle of some sort of medical event, right? And then he was brought outside the car. I guess the question that I have for you, again, is what level of evidence would need to be shown to get to reasonable doubt? I mean, you seem incredibly certain, right? All I'm saying is that the reasonable doubt standard is what pertains in criminal justice. What would it take to get you to reasonable doubt? Or is there no reasonable doubt that could be achieved simply by dint of the fact that he had his knee on his neck? By the way, it's not for the full 9 minutes. There are minutes where it's on his back. I mean, even the prosecution acknowledges that. The real question is, I think, the last 50 seconds, right? The last 50 seconds of the tape where Floyd stops breathing and Chauvin's knee is still on his neck. That is really the question as to whether this goes into criminal charge territory. Otherwise, he ends up being in a position where he's actually just using a typical subdual technique before you put the guy back in the car and you take him off to jail.
And I'm saying, to answer your question, there's absolutely nothing that could convince me that Derek Chauvin deserved a different outcome because of what you just articulated, what we saw, even if it's for the last 50 seconds. I'm not changing my position.
I mean, this is a real question. Do you think so we talked about race a little bit. Do you think that Chauvin was a racist? This is a race-based crime in your view?
Do I believe that?
Yes.
I don't believe that based on anything about his history that they articulated because I know how people conjure up evidence to go at it. I do believe his actions indicated that because I didn't see him doing that with anybody else. And the times that we were living in and the climate, as you articulated accurately, I might add, the heightened level of sensitivity that it exists because of brutality on the part of some police officers. By the way, I never say police brutality because I don't like to.
Now, Stephen A. Smith is pointing to something very important here, ladies and gentlemen, is that was this a race-based crime? And so I think Ben Shapiro is attempting to corner Stephen A. Smith with this question, but it's a very simple question to answer, right? I mean, if it's not direct discrimination, then it's indirect discrimination. And so was this a practice that Chauvin would have used on a suspect of a different race? And if we can't point to Chauvin using this practice on a suspect of a different race, then that tells us that this is an indirect discrimination, that there is a disparate impact that this practice had on George Floyd. Indeed, I mean, he's not with us today. Let's continue.
To castigate all police officers that way. I know if I'm in trouble, I'm calling 911. I'm not going to sit up there and denigrate police officers throughout this country. But there's rogues that exist in every profession. And I think there's rogues that exist with certain police officers. So to me, he came across as one. And that was my problem with it. Having said that, I want to get to something else because we're going to stay on this subject of race in this regard. When you saw the climate that exists, I understand you believe it was primarily instigated by the left. I want to know where you draw the line in the sand. And in terms of veering away from the political and just looking at a case on its merit and saying, this is what I see, this is where I stand, completely devoid of politics. I'm not talking race, I'm talking politics, meaning this has nothing to do with politics. This is the climate that we're living in. This officer should have known better, etc. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you're able to dismiss yourself from the political impact of something or the political agenda of something to draw your conclusions?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that in this particular case, this is a good indicator of trying to withdraw from a political sort of calculation, given the fact that, as some people pointed out on a pragmatic level, they suggested that President Trump pardoning Derek Chauvin would be bad for President Trump politically. And the case that I've made is that's his job. Determine what's pragmatic for him politically. It's my job to call something out as wrong when I see it to be wrong. In terms of criminal justice cases that have involved race, where I've removed myself on the other side, I mean, there are a bunch of them. Walter Scott, right, is a great example of a black man who was victimized by a white police officer. The police officer ends up convicted and going to jail. You're saying I'm not campaigning on his behalf because he deserves to go to jail, the officer in the Walter Scott case. There have been a number of horrifying or police-involved crimes in which the police officer deserves to lose his job and or go to jail, depending on the activities of the police officer. And you have to analyze those one by one. And I think that what we've seen, particularly from the legacy media over the course of the last many.
Now, I think he's talking about the Walter Scott case, where he's saying that this was one of those cases where, like, the officer should have went to jail, and the Walter Scott cases where the person was running and he was, you know, the police officer shot him in his back. And so, ladies and gentlemen, but does a person have to be running away from the police for you to say that this kind of conduct is wrong, Ben Shapiro? It's wrong. I think we're finished with this video. So it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Everybody has a right to life, an inherent right to life. And in this is one of those situations that does not warrant that life to be taken away. Of course, in my opinion, I don't think that it does. And so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Can I share this? Okay. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the general comment number 36, which is the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council. And so I want to read this paragraph 12. So deprivation of life is, as a rule, arbitrary if it is inconsistent with international law or domestic law. A deprivation of life may, nevertheless, be authorized by domestic law and still be arbitrary. So, ladies and gentlemen, even if U.S. law permitted Chauvin to put his knee on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, and that was the result that his life was taken from that, right? That still was arbitrary. The notion of arbitrariness is not to be fully equated with against the law, but must be interpreted more broadly to include elements of inappropriateness, injustice, a lack of predictability and due process of law, as well as elements of reasonableness, necessity, and proportionality. In order to be qualified as arbitrary under Article 6, the application of potentially lethal force by a private person acting in self defense, this is talking about a private person, or by another person coming to his or her defense, must be strictly necessary in view of that threat posed by the attacker. It must represent a method of last resort after other alternatives has been exhausted or deemed adequate. Ladies and gentlemen, was this last resort for Derek Chauvin? No, it wasn't, was it? It wasn't last resort. There could have been other control methods that Chauvin could have used to restrain George Floyd, but he didn't use those other control methods, did he? The amount of force applied cannot exceed the amount strictly needed for responding to the threat. The force applied must be carefully directed only against the attacker, and the threat responded to must involve imminent death or serious injury. Now, ladies and gentlemen, did George Floyd pose an imminent threat to Derek Chauvin? And I think the answer to that is no. Indeed, let's go back to the evidence. George Floyd on the ground, on the pavement, Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck, and George Floyd saying that he can't breathe and that he's calling for his mom, and his hands are, I believe, handcuffed behind his back, and Chauvin's not calling for assistance. He's not saying he's being attacked. The use of potentially lethal force for law enforcement purposes is an extreme measure. Let me repeat that. The use of potentially legal force for law enforcement purposes is an extreme measure that should be resorted to only when strictly necessary in order to protect life or prevent serious injury from imminent threat. So, ladies and gentlemen, we already went through the scenario. There wasn't any imminent danger in this particular situation. It cannot be used, for example, in order to prevent the escape from custody of a suspected criminal or a convict who does not pose a serious and imminent threat to the lives or bodily integrity of others. Let me repeat that, ladies and gentlemen. It cannot be used in order to prevent the escape from custody of a suspected criminal or a convict who does not pose a serious and imminent threat to the lives or bodily integrity of others. The intentional taking of life by any means is permissible only if it is strictly necessary in order to protect life from an imminent threat. Was there an imminent threat in this particular case, ladies and gentlemen? No, there wasn't. And we didn't get a sense that there was And so the facts of this case demonstrate that the sentence that Chauvin received is proportionate. He's responsible for that unalivement. Now, whether you now I know there's a lot of people that disagree. They're like, we don't like Floyd. They're saying that they don't like Floyd because Floyd is, because he's black, and that's essentially what it boils down to, because he's black, right? But even if he committed a crime on the day in question, and again, there's a lot of allegations that are being lodged against Floyd, even, after he's died. And those allegations aren't any that I condone, right? And so we need to look at the human on the day in question. And so oftentimes what people do is they run a criminal background check on a person and say, this is why that justifies that person being unalive, but no, it doesn't. Okay, if the person has a criminal background, okay, that's in the past. And even if we say, well, Kiana, he was doing a crime on the day in question, yes, perhaps so. But that crime that he was doing that wasn't a crime that, when we think about it, ladies and gentlemen, was that a crime that warrants an extrajudicial execution in a democracy? The answer is no. If we're living in a democracy, then we shouldn't be seeing state crimes like that happen to civilians on the street. And essentially, that's what it was, a state crime. And that state crime was publicized for the entire world to see. And there was a consensus from the global community that that was wrong. So no, Derek Chauvin shall not be pardoned for taking George Floyd's life. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.